They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were, because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant, and were afraid to ask him about it. They came to Capernaum. When he was in their house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." He took a little child who he placed amongst them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Well, during the past few chapters of Mark, we've seen Jesus travel to the region of Tyre, then to the Decapolis, and in this week's reading, we find him back in his home territory of Galilee. But actually, Mark tells us he doesn't want anybody to know quite yet. The reason why? Well, actually, he's got some critical teaching for his disciples, and for his disciples only at this point. A little tangent for you. I don't know whether anybody here has ever done an escape room or has any clue what an escape room is, but me and my family quite enjoy doing escape rooms. They are, as you might expect from the name, rooms from which you have to escape. Although it's not quite as simple as that. You'll often have them themed, from Vikings to bank robberies, Indiana Jones to the circus. I think I've even done an Albert Einstein as themed escape room. But you find yourself based in a fictional scenario, and you have to solve riddles and puzzles, work out what's going on, to get the key and finally get out of the room. Often, you work better as a team. Sometimes, your teammates annoy you. That's just the truth. But there's a range of puzzles, hidden keys, you have to look in everything, secret messages, sometimes secret rooms. I've even done a couple that have got a little bit of animatronics in them as well. And as you find these puzzles, as you decipher the clues, you find yourself closer and closer to winning the game and to escaping this room. As you'd imagine, some of the clues are tricky. They are cryptic. They come in two parts. They don't initially make sense. You can often find yourself looking for clues that aren't actually there. Spend ages fixating on something that is completely meaningless or a red herring. And I've even heard a story of an escape room where this one team started pulling the bricks out of the wall because they thought there must be something hidden behind them. And they had to stop that game pretty quickly. Actually, a lot of the clues involve lateral thinking. But often the ones that end up being the trickiest, sometimes, are the really simple ones. Because you start overthinking them. You start thinking, well, it can't be this easy. Surely this must mean something else. Actually, during Mark's Gospel, we've heard Jesus talk in many cryptic ways. In ways where his message might not have always been clear to those listening, or in ways that actually, whilst they might have a clear meaning on the surface, they also have a hidden, deeper meaning. He's talked in parables and other ways that the disciples have needed explaining to them. You remember a few chapters ago, Jesus warns the disciples about the leaven of the Pharisees, and they think he's having a go at them for getting bread, for not bringing the bread with them. But it's much more complex than that. In comparison, Jesus' teaching at the beginning of our verses today seems pretty straightforward to us. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight. The disciples didn't quite know what was coming. But despite the seeming simplicity of this message, the disciples again just don't seem to get it. Perhaps they are looking for something a bit more cryptic. Perhaps they're thinking it can't be this simple. Or perhaps they just think this is not what a Messiah should be doing. Mark tells us, though, that not only do they not get it, they are actually too afraid to ask Jesus about what this means. I think actually it is quite understandable that the disciples don't quite get it. This is actually only the second time that in Mark's Gospel that Jesus has talked about his death and resurrection. And it's not something the Jewish people were expecting. Jesus' death and resurrection was probably not part of the disciples' game plan for what Messiah should be doing. To them it might seem like a footballer declaring that they were going to play the biggest game of their season with their legs tied together. It didn't seem to make sense. But they don't ask Jesus because they are afraid. Perhaps they remember the last time that Jesus told them about his death and resurrection. And actually, perhaps they remember the rebuke that Peter got as he rebuked Jesus. Perhaps they are trying to ignore trying to avoid the same fate. Perhaps, though, maybe they didn't want to look stupid. They didn't want to show their ignorance and say, we don't get it, what's going on? Perhaps they were just pretending and nodding and agreeing, yes, Jesus, of course, Jesus. Particularly as later we see that they seem to be focused on which of them might be the greatest. Well, you can't show ignorance if you're the greatest, can you? Perhaps, though, they're afraid because they don't want to understand this message of the Messiah who suffers and dies. Because actually that might need them to shift their thinking, to live their lives differently. In any case, their fear of asking any questions to Jesus actually means that they stay in this state of ignorance and confusion for a while longer. Actually, at this moment, their fear, I think, hinders their discipleship. And so before we move on to the crux of this chapter, where we think about who is the greatest, actually I think it might be a good time for us to just briefly pause, to look inward and to ask ourselves the question whether there is currently any fear in our lives that is hindering us on our faith journey. Perhaps there is a fear of asking questions because we think that people might judge us if we don't really get it. Perhaps we might fear that actually if we really got it, that we might have to change the way we're living. Perhaps we have a fear that we're not good enough. Perhaps there are some more general fears. Fear about our families, our health, about the state of the world. Fear of losing loved ones. Perhaps there are fears like that that are hindering our faith journey at the moment. Well, let's just take 30 seconds of quiet before we move on to look inward and to be honest. And if there is any fear that we have that is hindering our discipleship, hindering our faith journey, just in this moment to offer it to God. So what the disciples do with this fear, it seems, instead of asking Jesus, well, what do you mean the Son of Man will be handed over to men, will die, and will rise again 3 days later? Instead, it seems that they choose to argue, to bicker. And as they're walking down the road, they have this argument, and Jesus approaches them almost like a parent who knows exactly what his children have done wrong, but he's going to give them the benefit of the doubt, give them a chance to own up to it. You know, that approach, rather than just going to them and telling them off, go, well, what's happened here then? I see there's a pen on the wall. How did that get there? Actually, Jesus seems to approach the disciples with this attitude. What have you been arguing about? But we know that Jesus knows what they've been arguing about because they don't tell him and he still tells them off for it. You know, the disciples think if we keep our mouths shut, he won't know that we've been arguing about who's the greatest. But of course, Jesus knows. He's not stupid. Quite enjoyed my time as a youth worker. And the young people thought they could get away with lots of stuff. Thought I would have no clue what was going on. But they were very obvious about it. They thought they were being so discreet. And I think maybe the disciples were doing the same. They thought they'd managed to get away with it. But actually they've been arguing about this question, well, who is the greatest? Actually, if Jesus is the Messiah, then actually, well, surely we are like royal consorts in waiting. And which of us is going to be the greatest, the closest to Jesus? Actually, the Jewish culture of the day, the whole culture of the day, worked in a very hierarchical way. There was a culture of honour. And your place in that culture was defined by your family, who your family were, who you were associated with, what job you did. So perhaps the disciples were trying to line themselves up, decide the order in which they were the greatest. Who was Jesus' best friend? Who was going to be closest to him, his second in command? Maybe they were saying, I cast out the most demons. I performed the most miracles, though. I walked on water for that little bit. Perhaps they were saying, he picked me to go and see him on the mountain when there was a transfiguration. Actually, who is Jesus closest to? Who of us is the greatest? We see later who is going to sit at the right hand, who's going to sit at the left hand. And actually, they don't resolve this in this reading today. We see them struggling with this. And they ask the same question in a few chapters' time, I think in chapter 10, a bit later on. If Jesus is the Messiah, and is the Messiah that we are hoping and expecting he will be, then actually, where do we fit in that hierarchy? This question, though, of who is the greatest is not one that was new then. I'm sure it had been going on for a long time. And actually is one that still prevails today. You just have to turn your telly on a Saturday night, watch Strictly, and we are trying to work out who is the greatest celebrity dancer. But there's TV programmes that try and ask us who is the greatest baker, the greatest singer, the greatest dancer, the greatest apprentice. Actually, there are various measures in society of what it means for people to be great, to have importance, to have power. Actually, it might have its place, but in school we rank and we grade our children in terms of their intelligence, of how well they can do in tests, who is the top of the class. We might measure success and greatness by how big our house is, how many cars we've got on the drive, if we have a swimming pool. I don't think any of us have a swimming pool, I don't know. Who has the most money? Who's got the best job title? Actually, we might measure greatness in many ways in society. But Jesus' response to his disciples flips that on its head. He flips that idea of what it means to be great straight on its head. Jesus sits the disciples down and he says this: anybody who wants to be first must be the very last, the servant of all. You can imagine the disciples puzzling this one. This one perhaps is a bit more of a cryptic clue. What does this mean? Whoever wants to be first must be last. Actually, what starts as a little bit confusing for the disciples turns into downright odd as Jesus continues. Takes a little child, placed it amongst them. I'm not sure where this child appears from. It was just him and his disciples a minute ago. But perhaps the crowds have started to gather. And he takes the child in his arms and he says to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Actually, this makes for quite a nice scene, doesn't it? You might have it on a baptism or a christening card, but actually, this is not just something nice and simple and sweet that Jesus is saying, but it's quite controversial. We might not find ourselves that concerned about the presence of a child, but actually in Jesus' day, children were considered second-class citizens, along with tax collectors, sinners. Children were considered unproductive, they were considered burdensome. Not only this, but we know that children are vulnerable, not just in the ancient society, but children are vulnerable in their very nature. But that was amplified in ancient culture because they had no protection under the law. Children found themselves at the bottom of the social hierarchy. A child had no status, no rights. It certainly did not have anything to offer anyone in terms of honour and status. But it is with these little children that Jesus identifies. Jesus the Messiah. This is quite radical. Jesus is saying that actually the answer to that question, who is the greatest, it doesn't come by how much power, how much wealth, what status we have, but actually about how we come alongside those who are the most vulnerable in society, who are looked down on, who are trodden on. Actually, while billionaires are trying to prove themselves the greatest by seeing who can get into space first, who can build the best rocket, we know that there are more and more people, children, families, adults, finding themselves in poverty in this country and around the world. It's all well and good looking outward and saying, well, we've got some bad metrics of greatness, but I think if we're honest and we look inward, the church at times, we probably measure our success, our greatness by the wrong metric. You know, is it a good event because we've had lots of people attend, because we've had great amount of donations? Was it a good event? Are we doing really well because our church building is so busy? Well, perhaps there is a different metric for greatness. I think that Mark is pointing to something so important, something essential about believing in Jesus. Because by God becoming human, by God becoming incarnate in the person of Jesus, that upended every assumption of what it meant to be great, that the world seemed to deem as definitive. When God became human, we saw that greatness is not about separation, but about solidarity. Not about being better than, but about relationship. About empowerment and encouragement of the other. You know, in this moment, Jesus seems to be saying that greatness is not about power, it's not about wealth, but it's determined by our weakness, our vulnerability, by our service and our sacrifice, by our humility, by our truthfulness, our faithfulness. This kind of greatness, I think, we are called to embody so that the world can see the true meaning of what it means to be great. The greatness that is born out of love. And so as we look forward as a church, as we look inward at our own journeys, may we measure our success, our greatness, not just on how many seats are filled, not just on how busy our events are, or how much money we manage to raise, or how many things we're putting on. May we measure our success and our greatness not by human metrics, but by the metrics of the kingdom. May we be known for coming alongside those whose society has forgotten, for coming alongside those who are vulnerable, who are weak, who are suffering. I find it quite interesting that this idea of who is the greatest and this idea of the first becoming last comes straight after Jesus has talked about his death and his resurrection. Because in many ways, Jesus is the perfect example of what it means for the first to become last. Of what it means to get alongside those who are weak, who are vulnerable. You know, these verses about the first becoming last are a continuation of what it means for Jesus to be Messiah. You know, the God, all-powerful, almighty, who created the universe, who is first, without a doubt, humbles himself into the form of a vulnerable baby. Humbles himself and becomes the lowest, the servant of all. The God of the universe comes incarnate alongside the lowest and the most vulnerable. You know, his disciples are not made up of the greatest in society's eyes, not the scholars, not the wealthy or the royal family, but of the tax collectors, the sinners, the fishermen. Jesus is the greatest example, coming in complete vulnerability, coming alongside the last, the least, and the lost, coming alongside us in our vulnerability, our brokenness. And so may we be encouraged to follow that example of what it means to be great. Not seeking fame and wealth for fame and wealth's sake. Not seeking power for power's sake. But coming alongside those who are broken. humbling ourselves, coming alongside the vulnerable. Because as we come alongside the people who are at the lowest of the social hierarchy, as we come alongside those who are vulnerable, and as we welcome them, well, Jesus tells us we welcome him, but not only him, we welcome God. In a moment we will turn to communion and we will remember that actually Jesus' status, his power, his greatness actually led him to humble himself to the cross. For each one of us. Because the reality is that all of us without Jesus are vulnerable. All of us without Jesus are broken, are empty. But let us just take a moment to reflect and thank Jesus for the fact that actually he did not stay up in heaven with all of his power, with all of his glory, but he shed that to come in the form of a child, in the form of a baby, to come alongside that. So we're going to pray, we're going to sing, and then after we've sung a song, Mike is going to come and lead us in our communion this morning.
Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: his wounds have paid my ransom. Why should I gain from his reward?